Architecture first societies might sound like a very natural type of a topic. But in truth, it's one that is riddled with certain perplexities about how do we start, when does it begin historically, and when does it end. So I've taken the approach that obviously, since it's first societies, we're talking about when society first sort of was formed, all sorts of debates about when that may happen. Archaeologically, we don't really know because the footprint of first societies on the planet was relatively light. But let's say 200,000 years ago, people came together in a way that we would sort of recognize if we were to encounter them in southern Africa at that time. They had communities, they had certain rituals, hunting, food gathering, and so forth, that we would sort of understand. These were not sort of primitive people. So for me, when writing this book and researching the topic, it sort of also asks the question that often in our own sort of environment, we have books called primitive architecture. And so what I wanted to do was get away from the suggestion that these first societies were making things that we would look today and say this is primitive. So that doesn't mean that building with sticks and mud and stone is of a different category than building with building skyscrapers out of steel and concrete. Yes, it's a different material, but we should sort of try to get away from the distinction between sort of civilized architecture, if you will, and sort of primitive. So for me, doing this research was to sort of try to open up the field, relax our view about this, both historically and historiographically, as well as even philosophically, about the architecture that was produced. So if we start 200 some odd thousand years ago, 250, with the first archaeological evidence of space and architecture being made, when does that end? So now, normally we could say, well, that ended when we started making cities and moving into sort of more states and nations in this sort of quote civilized manner. But in reality, first societies still exist today. All you have to do is go to parts of Brazil or to other places, even in Russia, in Siberia, you have sort of residual cultures that are still living in these ways, or in Africa. So part of my argument is that we still live in a first society world. And in some sense, even though we don't have all the attributes of first society anymore, we don't have shamans, we don't have ritual dances that we go to on moonlit nights and all these type of things, we still are living in their world. So if we write a history that assumes that their world is finished, then comes the next stage of advancement, and then comes the next stage of advancement, and that these original first society people are in some sense backwards or behind the times, we're really missing the point that these society people, the first society people, still exist. We're still living in their world, and perhaps we should write the history a little bit from that perspective. So the book ends with today. So it sort of shows how first society have diminished, certainly very dramatically over time, through disease, through colonial conquest, through nation-state repressions, through religion, Islamization, Christianization. All these sort of activities have imposed their will on the first societies, as well as the influx of agriculture and all sorts of things have transformed first societies into a very, very, very small aspect of our current global population. But they're still there. They still haven't completely been exterminated yet. And now, in some sense, these residual pockets of first society in places of Africa or Brazil, Australia and whatnot, they happen to be in places that for a long time were no man's lands, deserts and swamps and steppe and so forth. And lo and behold, it's these places that are discovered for gold and lumber and all sorts of things. We, as sort of our own sort of advanced cultures, are now encountering the last remnants of these first societies in their native habitat and realizing that basically we're in the process of re-exterminating them, and maybe in a generation they will all be gone. So the fight in Brazil currently of their native populations against the gold mining and log mining, and these sort of are still touch points of how we interact with native societies. So I wanted to end the book with a view that the native society population is still there, and still we are still in the power position where we can easily exterminate them with the flick of a finger, practically. So is that what we want? Do we want to be the generation that prides ourselves on exterminating the last of the first societies? So I hope not. But the book is not trying to set up a political argument as such, even though it touches on this sort of conflict. It really tries to sort of map out the history from 200,000 BC to today. And it tries to do that in a way that I would sort of say is global, in the sense that it doesn't just say, okay, this is what's happening in Africa and this is what's happening in Siberia or the Americas, but tries to get the reader to understand connections that might be happening through migrations, through changes, through climate, through different things that sort of produce sort of coherencies that might not be visible today. So, for example, 40,000 years ago, we have the oldest example of what's called a pit house, where you dig a meter or so down into the ground, and then you build a structure over it, usually of a cone-shaped structure of wood and timber and leaves and grass and thatch and stuff like that. It's called the pit house, which is a terrible name because it looks like you're living in a pit, but it's not, right? And the reason you build down a meter or so is because when the earth freezes, your feet, and you get up in the morning, no one wants to stand up on a frozen ground, right? So it's just below the frost line. So it's an invention that if you put your house down a meter or two, your feet aren't frozen when you wake up in the morning, and you put down some furs and so forth, and it's really very comfortable. Well, the pit house developed in the eastern part of Russia or Western Europe in around 40,000 BC, and then with the hunters, it was brought to China, and we see evidence of it in China. If you go to Japan, you're going to see the same prototype in Japan. Now it begins 10,000 years later, 15,000 years later, it gets refined because the post gets stronger, but it's still the same type of building. And then the migrations, you find it in Alaska, so the pit house is still there. Exact same type of prototype. And then in the 12th century AD, some fellows in Alaska migrated down to Arizona and in Utah, called the Navajo, and they brought the pit house down all the way down to there. So if you look at this pit house, culture, which is, now we're talking about Americas in the Southwest, and you can sort of see these long continuities, both in time, going back to 40,000 BC to 1200 AD. So that's, we're talking tens of thousands of years. We see changes and development through the different types of climates and so forth. But the basic prototype is very clear. So we can map out how different cultures produce different variations on this thematic. Today, of course, if we wanted to do that history, we'd have to go to Ukraine, we'd have to go to Romania, we'd have to go to Russia, you have to go up into the Siberia, we'd have to go to China and Japan, Alaska, Canada, the United States, and so forth. We'd have to go through all of these nations to do all of this stuff, right? So if we remember that in those days, these nations didn't exist, and this great hunting tradition is one example of a global paradigm, right? Really spanned time and geography. So, as the hunting tradition died in Eastern Russia, it was still going strong in Siberia, and as it died in Siberia, it was still going strong in the Americas. So we have to sort of see the sort of movement and the architecture that sort of went with it. So the book tries to sort of produce these maps that help one understands the space and time continuum of various types of traditions. So the pit house is just being sort of one example. So we can sort of map out even how sort of the pit house then even sort of was encountered when the Spaniards came to the Americas. They encountered the Native Americans there, the Navajo who were living in the pit house. They're called the Hogan. That was the Navajo word for it, right? Then we can actually sort of see living encounters, right, between the Spaniard, the conquistadors, and they're coming and encountering this type of architecture. So it's not just the archaeological record, but we see actually other types of records that are used to help to describe these things. And then, of course, from anthropology, we get descriptions of how these things were built. They were not just houses as we might understand them today, but they were cosmological diagrams. The house that I live in is no cosmology in it at all. It has whatever, it's just a house, But these pit houses were cosmological diagrams. They had up and they had down. They were part of a shamanistic universe where the fire was an important axis, vertical axis through the building. Where you sat in relationship to the fire was important. Usually you sat on the west side facing the east side. In Mongolia, usually facing on the north side looking south. But there's always the power side opposite the entrance. And how people moved around and the children went on one side, the guests would go on the other side. So they mapped inside particular sort of family and social geographies. So, I go in my house and I can turn right or left into the living room, dining room, whatever it is. But, in the pit house, this is where the grandmother sat, this is where the father sat, this is where the, and so forth, right? These geographies were very, very spelled out. So they were not just arbitrary, right? They mapped out family relations, they mapped out cosmological relationships between the world below, the world above, and the sort of shamanistic culture. So they were much more powerful than any house that I could even possibly live in. But yet we would have called this normally primitive, but this is my point, is that this is precisely not primitive. The house I live in is significantly more primitive in that sense than any pit house that you would find in Siberia or Japan from 10,000 BC or to the Hogans today in even in more recent time. So I can explain a little bit about the word primitive because it's a relatively complicated term, and there are many ways in which one can use it, in which way I'm using it, and which ways perhaps others might want to use it. So, for example, if we think of techniques of production, we could say that one can go to a slum in Caracas, and there's sort of people are using lumber and corrugated steel and so forth in ways that we wouldn't think of as sort of producing a substantial architecture, right? Or architecture that would sort of last over time. That primitive here is sort of temporary, it's sort of tactical, it's used to make sheds and so forth. And yes, there's a sort of quality that sometimes we can look at in how people have embraced certain materials to produce temporary architecture. The primitive that I'm sort of not talking about, right, which is the architecture for societies, may have some of these attributes, right? It may be material that will dissolve away in a rain if it's made out of mud, or material made out of wood or thatch that will have to be repaired consistently over time if they're not valued and so forth. And there's some architecture that is almost throwaway, right? So the Dakong people in the Congo, they will build a hut, and then after a season, when they're done, they'll just go off and abandon the hut and build a new one. So it just, in that sense, temporary, because they don't take it with them or move it about with them. They'll just make a new one. But there's a little bit of a difference, I would say, in that what I want to look at is the social relationship to architecture as such, as opposed to just the techniques of production and in terms of their material. So the reason the Dakong people abandon their huts is because when they go to a new site, they'll clear a place in the forest, and then the activity of making the new huts is a way of bonding the society again in that new place. So it's not that they have left their old hut behind, they're really building their culture again and again. So each year when they move, they're actually restoring the social fabric. And new children get born, the old people die, people go off and form different clans and so forth. So the yearly renovation of that society bonds it in a very flexible way, compared to our more static notion of society as sort of fixed and solid and immobile. Here, the reason the Dakong have survived for tens and hundreds of thousands of years is that every year they sort of renew that through the architectural production. So this is hardly sort of primitive. One can actually find a lot of things to admire about this sort of yearly production of architecture.